When I lived in Charleston, it was a very artsy scene. Most of our comedy took place at an improv theater where people came there and watched people create scenes out of thin air with no microphones. That's how good the acoustics were, that you could do a show on the stage with no microphones and the audience would still really enjoy the show. So these were very like, I don't know if cultured is the right word, but they're like
sophisticated
arts. Yeah, and they're into a show. They're in with you. They're I mean, improv, I'm not making fun of improv because I did it for a long time, but it's like they're there to watch a make-believe show. They're there to watch you create a show out of thin air, and they laugh with you and they have a good time. So this is an audience that you can be real hipster with, real artsy. I did a few shows at a coffee house open mic for it was a poetry open mic at a coffee house a pretty fancy place where they served wine and cheese, and people went in there to do real poetry, and they were very serious about it, and they would let me do comedy because I had a nice way of doing comedy and the poetry people liked it. But it's like, that's a different audience. I mean, I learned to do that. I was just talking to a guy on the radio from Michigan who lived in Charleston for a while, and I was talking to him about the kind of shows I did in Charleston, and he goes, well, you weren't doing like Spoleto Festival. And Spoleto Festival is like a very fancy kind of arts festival where they do plays and stuff like that. And I'm like, actually, I was. They would open, they had this like thing called like Piccolo Spoleto where they would kind of open it up to comics. So it was basically the fancy arts people watching us do stand-up comedy. Mm-hmm. And it's like, so you learn to do comedy that way. And then I started working the road. And I always use Johnson City as my reference. But I mainly use it because that's the first place at this Comedy Zone in Johnson City. That's the first place where I really like bombed. Now, I also bombed in Somerville, South Carolina, which is 30 minutes outside of Charleston. And they used to have a place ran by a guy named Tony Kemp. And I forget what it was called, but it was, basically a road comedy room. And I remember going up there with my set that I had just won the Charleston stand-up comedy competition with, and completely bombing, like complete silence in a shocking way. And that's how Johnson City was for me too. It's just like, and I was just so shocked by it, but I was dead set on that comedy was going to be my thing. I was going to do stand-up comedy. So it didn't matter that I bombed other than, that it hurt. It was like, all right, I'm just going to work harder and figure this out. I remember I had my West Point Pepperell white trucker hat in the car with me, and I was talking to my sister on the way home from that gig, and I said, I just don't feel like I'm relating with people. I said, I think I'm going to start wearing that hat just to be silly. And it was years later that I actually started wearing the hat on stage. And I think it was a funny moment that I had, but because I feel like people didn't believe that I lived in a trailer park. So I needed an article of clothing, and then they were like, oh, now we see it.
Yeah.